Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Whitehall Lecture Series. This is the second in a series of 5 lectures for this year's Whitehall Lecture Series. This is our 28th year of conducting the Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. We want to thank our sponsors, the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation, for helping to make this lecture possible, as well as the Palm Beach Post. Without the support of great sponsors, the quality of the programs we present here at the museum would not be possible. Each of you found at your seats a couple of printed items from the museum, a season program guide, which is a guide to all the programs available this season at the Flagler Museum, music series, an exhibition, the lecture series, and many other programs that I hope you'll take part in throughout the season here at the Flagler Museum. There's always something going on here at the museum. I think with that, I just want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Our lecture series this year, by the way, is focused on the presidents of the Gilded Age, and not those presidents that get so much attention, but the lesser-known presidents who were struggling as our economy shifted from an agrarian economy to a corporate economy that we have all grown up with. There was no rule book, there was no other example in the world to follow, and to figure out how to be a president during those difficult times was very challenging. Each of these presidents faced great challenges in trying to make that transition. Dr. Gene Edward Smith is our speaker today. He's a senior scholar in the history department at Columbia University. He worked for many years as a professor at the University of Toronto, and he's a biographer and historian. He, of course, wrote the book that is the subject of our lecture today, Grant, which was a 2002 Pulitzer Prize finalist. And in addition to that, he wrote biographies on General Lucius D. John Marshall, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and most recently, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's currently working on a biography on George W. Bush. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gene Edward Smith to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Thank you, John. It's a privilege to speak at the Flagler Museum. And it's a pleasure to return to General Grant after having spent most of the last year talking about Ike. Flying down from Washington, yesterday I began to think about the unwisdom of speaking too frequently and the wisdom of remaining silent. I was reminded of that wonderful Churchill story when a callow young member of Parliament came up to Churchill on the floor and said, "Prime Minister, I have just been elected to the House. Do you think it would be wise if I participated actively in debate?" Churchill looked at him appraisingly for a while and then said, No, I think it would not. I think it would be better if the House wondered why you didn't speak rather than why you did. I'm going to talk today about General Grant, about his generalship, his presidency, and his life. I noticed that the title given to the lecture states that Grant was no businessman. How President Grant saved the economy but lost his own shirt. We'll get there. But I believe it's far more important to understand who Grant was, what he accomplished, and why his reputation has suffered so severely, and not just in the business realm. Now, when Allison invited me to come down to speak, she said that it was essential that I have slides for the audience. PowerPoint, I think it's called. Having lectured in academia for 50 years, I have never done a PowerPoint presentation before. I remember during my undergraduate days at Princeton in the early 1950s, we had a course, Art and Architecture 101. It was offered every Monday and Wednesday at 12 o'clock. And the professor giving the course, a distinguished art historian, always had slides and paintings, of the paintings and buildings that he was going to discuss. We called the course Darkness at Noon. Now, being unfamiliar with the process, I have selected about 30 slides, which seemed to me best describe Grant. And rather than weave them through the lecture, I'm going to show them now and explain their significance, and then move on. When you're 80 years old, you can get away with that. This is a picture of General Grant. It's the one on the cover of the book, actually. This is General Grant as a full general. Grant is was the first person ever to be made a full general, four-star general in the history of the United States. Grant's parents, Jesse and Hannah. Grant was born in Ohio in 1822. The oldest of, he had 5 siblings. This is General Zachary Taylor. Old Rough and Ready, he was called. Taylor commanded the first portion of the Mexican War, won the Battle of Buena Vista. Grant admired Taylor greatly. Taylor had no use for Army uniforms, usually dressed himself in denim trousers and a white cotton duster. Often rode a mule instead of a horse, was very plain spoken, and very brave, and really became Grant's ideal. This is Winfield Scott, who commanded the second portion of the Mexican War. Grant also served under him. Scott was known as Old Fuss and Feathers. Taylor was known as Old Rough and Ready. General Lee served directly under Scott and really patented himself on General Scott. It was from General Scott that Grant learned that he could cut himself off from his supply base and live off the land, as Scott did between Veracruz and Mexico City. Grant, as an undergraduate at West Point, did not take the academy all that seriously. Just like Ike, both of them finished barely in the top half of their class. Grant devoted himself to reading books in the library and to painting. 9 of Grant's paintings survive to this day. 4 ink drawings, of which this is one, lands of a city in Europe. A watercolor of a European scene that Grant did at West Point. I might say that the art instructor at West Point, Robert Weir, a very famous Hudson Valley painter, also taught James Whistler, James McNeill Whistler, who was 2 years ahead of Grant. Whistler was tossed out of the academy because he failed chemistry. Later he said that if silicon had been a gas, he would become a major general. This is an oil painting that Grant did. Grant felt very deeply about the Indians, and this was done at the military academy. One of the 2 oil paintings that continued to survive. A watercolor that Grant did, and finally a horse. Grant was unquestionably the finest horseman to graduate from the military academy. He set a record for jumping that lasted for 30 years after his graduation. Grant admired horses. This is Grant in 1848 at Sackett's Harbor after the Mexican War in New York. After Grant was tossed out of the Army, he built, or after he resigned from the Army, he built a cabin in Missouri This was it. It was known as hardscrabble. Grant did his best at farming. He did not succeed. This was hand-built by Grant. You'll see the little outhouse out in the lower left. Grant in the Civil War after the Battle of Shiloh. He's now a major general, and it's a relatively young Grant at that point. The text of his demand to surrender Fort Donelson, given to his very good friend Simon Bolivar Buckner, and you will notice in the bottom he says that the terms are immediate and unconditional surrender, and if Buckner does not want to accept, I will move immediately on your works. First time that unconditional surrender was ever demanded by an American commander, and Grant, of course, became famous for it. This is Grant after the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness in Northern Virginia. You may recall that Union generals always crossed the Potomac and went to Virginia 5 times and came back 5 times. Grant met Lee in the Wilderness after a 3-day battle. Grant gave the order to move south, and here you see the cheers of the Army of the Potomac as Grant moved past. This is Grant after the Battle of Spotsylvania, also in Northern Virginia, on reconnaissance. Grant was a muddy boots general, and you can see there. You can see that. I don't know if any of you have ever said. I imagine most of you have seen the recent movie Lincoln, and there are a couple of scenes in there of Grant. Whoever did the costumes in there got Grant wrong. Grant never looked that good. This is Grant watching his maneuver to cross the James River in late 1864. He was tired of meeting Lee head on. He surprised everyone and crossed the James. This was an incredible amphibious operation. And you see there Grant there supervising. A famous painting known as the Peacemakers. This is the meeting of Lincoln and Sherman on the left, Grant between him and Lincoln and Admiral Porter at Hampton Roads, Virginia. Just before the end of the war, President Lincoln is telling Grant what his views are as to how the South should be treated. A very famous painting, which hangs in the White House. And this is Grant just before the Battle of Appomattox. This is one of the most famous photographs of Grant. You can see that this is really not someone you want to mess with. General Henry W. Halleck, who preceded Grant as General-in-Chief. When Grant succeeded him in the beginning of 1864 as General-in-Chief, Grant did not tell Halleck to leave. Grant left Halleck in Washington as Chief of Staff, while Grant, as General-in-Chief, took to the field with Meade's army in Northern Virginia. Grant was the General-in-Chief, but with the telegraph, he was able to place himself anywhere he wanted to. He did not want to be tied down at a desk as General-in-Chief. He left Halleck in charge in Washington, and Grant went to the field. Grant did not command the Army of the Potomac. He left Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. Grant was running all of the armies, but his headquarters was in the field with Meade. General George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. General Thomas weighed 300 pounds. General Thomas weighed 300 pounds. He was known as Old Slow Trot in the Army. He commanded the Army of the Cumberland. General Thomas was from Virginia. General Thomas is the only ranking general officer in the Army who was a Southerner who did not leave with his state. When Virginia seceded from the Union, Thomas was commanding the 2nd Cavalry at Carlisle Barracks at the time, went down to the local magistrate and took a new oath to preserve and defend the Constitution of the United States. Thomas had 3 maiden sisters living in Virginia. They turned George's picture to the wall and said that George had died on the day of Virginia's secession. General Sherman. General Sherman is one of the few Union generals who does not have a statue or a circle named for him in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure why, but he. General Phil Sheridan. Thomas weighed 300 pounds. Sheridan weighed barely over 100. shared his famous ride on Winchester at the Battle of Cedar Creek. It was a little easy for Winchester to carry Sheridan he only weighed roughly 100 pounds. And General Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. When Grant became General-in-Chief and came east, Meade thought he was going to be relieved as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant met with him, found that he was perfectly agreeable, and left Meade in charge. A very curious situation during the war where Grant, as General-in-Chief, had his headquarters, as I said earlier, with General Meade's army. Grant's wife, Julia. Julia was 4 years younger than Ulysses. She was a Southerner. She was from Missouri. Her family were slave owners. Julia's father lived with them in the White House. He was a convinced Democrat. It was always a problem placing him at the dinner table. These are the leaders of the Indian tribes. Grant was interestingly, I've always thought, Grant was elected in 1868 because people on the frontier thought he was going to end the Indian problem and destroy all of the Indians. Grant loved the Indians. You saw that picture he painted at West Point. He invited them to the White House. Grant's peace policy, he convinced them to go on the reservations. And here you see the great chiefs of the Indian tribes, including Red Cloud, visiting the White House. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was probably the leading spokesman for African Americans after the Civil War, was called Grant the last of the radicals, and was very fond of General Grant, and always campaigned for Grant in the elections. Hamilton Fish was Grant's Secretary of State for 8 years. We'll talk about that later, but one of the great Secretaries of State in American history. Grant and Chancellor Bismarck in Berlin. After the presidency, Grant undertook a 2-year tour of the world. And in that 2-year tour of the world, one of the high points was his stay in Berlin, where he and Bismarck got along famously. You'll see they are imbibing something there on the table. And Bismarck told Grant in one of these conversations, it was a terrible thing that the Civil War had to be so long. Brother fighting against brother. Grant said, no, it had to be long. We had to defeat the South totally, otherwise we could not have gotten rid of slavery. Grant, at the time he was elected to the presidency. And the final picture of Grant, dying of cancer, Mount McGregor, New York, writing the memoirs, which have become justly famous as one of the greatest works, really, in the English language. Grant wrote all of this as he was dying of cancer. I'm going to leave us here with there. So that's the darkness at noon. And when we look back on the life of General Grant, it seems to me that he, more than any figure other than President Lincoln, was responsible not only for saving the Union, but for the eradication of slavery as well. The Civil War was not a war between the states, much less between sovereign nations, but a rebellion. And President Lincoln, under his authority as Commander-in-Chief, and his responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, was simply suppressing a rebellion in the southern states, which remained part of the Union. And when we look back at that war, no two men better personified the cause for which they were fighting than Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. Lee, charismatically handsome, the son of White Horse Harry Lee, exemplified the romantic virtues of the South slaveholding aristocracy. Grant, the son of an Ohio tanner, indistinguishable in a crowd, even in uniform, personified the egalitarian values of a modern democratic society. Both men were superb general officers who had the complete loyalty of the armies they commanded. Lee's military career had been exemplary. Grant's was spotty. He knew failure and hard times and what it meant to live at the bottom of the economic ladder. Lee stood for a way of life that was ending. Grant for the new era of American democracy that was beginning. Lee represented America's past, Grant the future. Life had been hard for Grant. Forced to resign from the Army in 1854, he had spent 7 years fighting a losing battle against poverty, reduced at times to selling firewood on a street corner in St. Louis. When Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Grant was working as a clerk in the leather goods store owned by his family. Denied a place in the regular army, Grant was commissioned a colonel of volunteers and moved quickly up the Union chain of command. Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, then the campaign in Northern Virginia, made it clear that Grant was the nation's preeminent soldier. 3 times during the war, Grant took the surrender of a Confederate army. In 1862 at Donelson, in 1863 at Vicksburg, and at Appomattox. Each time his terms were generous. At Appomattox, the troops were allowed to keep their horses and mules and take them home for spring plowing. After Lincoln's death and during the desperate years of the Johnson administration, Grant was the most powerful man in the country. His election to president in 1868 was a foregone conclusion, and his re-election over Horace Greeley in 1872 was a walkover. Grant finished his 2 terms as president at the peak of his popularity. No American has carried greater fame out of the White House than the silent man who leaves it today, wrote James Garfield. For the next 2.5 years, Grant toured the world, received everywhere by heads of state and adoring crowds. In 1880, Grant came within an eyelash of being nominated for a 3rd term, although he did not actively seek it. Afterwards, he entered the investment banking business in New York, only to suffer a humiliating bankruptcy when a corrupt partner brought down the firm of Grant and Ward in 1864. Penniless and without a pension or any other means of support, Grant turned to writing, and in the last year of his life, fatally ill with cancer, wrote the memoirs that not only rescued his family from poverty, but established his reputation as one of the finest writers in the English language. Let me say a word now about Grant and Ward and how Grant lost his shirt. In 1881, after the world tour, Grant joined a young Wall Street whiz kid by the name of Ferdinand Ward, formed the firm of Grant and Ward. Grant provided much of the initial capital. Ward managed the firm. Between 1881 and 1884, Grant and Ward flourished. Investors reaped enormous rewards, with dividends running as high as 40% a year. Bradstreet, the predecessor of Dun & Bradstreet, Bradstreet rated the firm gilt-edged. Grant, who did not play an active role in the management of the firm, believed himself to be a millionaire. But it was a Ponzi scheme. Ferdinand Ward was the Bernie Madoff of the 1880s. In early 1884, the firm went belly up. Ward could not raise the money to pay the investors or the banks who were loaning to the firm. Grant was blindsided. The liabilities of Grant and Ward exceeded $16 million. The assets totaled $57,000. Grant lost everything that he owned: his townhouse on East 66th Street, all of its furnishings, all of his investments. Ward fled, was soon captured, tried in New York State, and sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing. Grant refused to accept charity. Congress responded to his flight, restored him to the rank of General of the Army shortly before his death. Jeffrey Ward, who was the grandson of Ferdinand Ward, has written a book which was published last year and which you have back there, titled A Disposition to be Rich, which details the life of his grandfather, Ferdinand Ward. Now, it's always an armchair exercise among historians to rank presidents. And really, until the last decade or two, Grant was always placed at the bottom, along with Warren G. Harding and James Buchanan. The Grant that came down through history was depicted as a drunkard, as a dim-witted butcher who won his victories simply by sending men to slaughter. As president, he was viewed as incompetent, and if not personally corrupt, at least an accomplice to the corruption of the age. Fact is that truth differs considerably. Grant had a drinking problem in the early 1850s, stationed at Fort Humboldt on the Pacific coast without his wife. He grew morose, suffered from cabin fever, and drank more than he could handle. One day he was found inebriated at pay call. His commanding officer gave him the option of resigning or standing court-martial. Grant chose to resign because he didn't want Julia and his parents to know of the fact. As for the charges that Grant was a butcher, Grant's casualty ratio was consistently lower than Lee's, despite the fact that Lee was always fighting in the defensive, usually behind breastworks, and Grant was on the offensive. In absolute numbers, Lee lost more men in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg than Grant did at Cold Harbor. In proportional terms, Lee lost 4 times as many. As for corruption, the Grant administration was no better and no worse than others. To some degree, it's a question of semantics. Government employees in those days were all political appointees, patronage appointments, and historians are inclined to say that a politically partisan civil service is corrupt. Given Grant's stature as the nation's preeminent citizen then, from the 1860s until his death in 1885, why has his reputation been so tarnished? First, there are several reasons. First, I think it was a question of appearance. That's not so bad, but Grant didn't look like a president any more than he looked like a general. Always slightly rumpled, reeking of cigar smoke. He was easy for historians to put down. I mentioned earlier, though, that Grant's model was Taylor, who probably looked even worse. Second, there was a fluttering of East Coast intellectuals who despised Grant because he was a soldier, and they could not tolerate the idea of a soldier in the White House. But there's really a more profound reason, I think, why Grant was condemned, and that was what he stood for. As president, Grant fought for black equality long after it was popular. He defended the rights of African Americans with the same tenacity that held the Union line at Shiloh. For Grant, Reconstruction meant a new order in the South, with freedmen integrated into the social and political fabric. And by the late 1870s, that was no longer fashion. The nation had tired of the Negro question, and reconciliation with the white South became the order of the day. Jim Crow replaced Reconstruction, and for almost 100 years, mainstream historians, not just the lost cause historians, but mainstream historians led by the Dunning School at Columbia, unsympathetic to black equality, brutalized Grant's presidency. Grant was a casualty to the national mood of apartheid. White supremacists succeeded where Lee had failed. For 3 generations, Grant was systematically denigrated, and his contribution to preserving the nation was perversely denied. Quite simply, if Lincoln had not discovered Grant in 1862 and brought him to Washington in 1864, it would be a very different North America in which we live today. Now, to sum up Grant's impact, let me suggest that he left 3 distinct legacies: military, presidential, and political. Militarily, Grant changed the way we look at war. The idea that war was an exercise in maneuver was rejected, and we began to concentrate our effort on destroying the enemy army. Grant, as general, ignored cities, rail junctions, and supply points, cared very little about occupying territory, but he was relentless in pursuit of the enemy army and absolutely determined to destroy it. Presidentially, Grant is the father of the modern presidency. Until the Grant administration, cabinet officers were viewed as responsible to Congress, not the president. By contrast, Grant treated them just as he treated Sherman and Sheridan, as his subordinates. It rubbed many in Washington the wrong way, but eventually Grant's view was sustained, and the accountability of federal officers to the president, not to Congress, was upheld by Chief Justice Taft in Myers versus United States in 1927. In substantive terms, Grant, as president, steered the United States onto the world stage. He avoided war with Spain over Cuba, reversed the downward spiral in Anglo-American relations, settled the Alabama claims that had been contentious since the Civil War, established the precedent for international arbitration, resolved a long-standing boundary dispute with Canada, and rewrote the international law pertaining to the obligation of neutrals. The Treaty of Washington of 1871 ended the hostility that had simmered between the United States and Great Britain since as far back as the War of 1812. On the domestic scene, Grant crushed the Ku Klux Klan, routed white terrorism in the South, defended the rights of African Americans to political and legal equality. No other president has carried on such a determined struggle against such hopeless odds to protect the freedmen in the exercise of their constitutional rights. Similarly with Native Americans, you saw the picture of Grant. What historians call Grant's peace policy eventually brought peace to the Great Plains, broke the corrupt ring of Indian agents who had profited at the expense of Native Americans, and paved the way for the assimilation and eventual citizenship of the nation's original inhabitants. always overlooked by historians intent on trashing the Grant administration, is that it was Grant who established the first Civil Service Commission. It was Grant who established the National Park System, beginning with Yellowstone in 1872. It was Grant who in 1875 tamped down the raging controversy over religious influence in the public schools. This was a Blaine Amendment to the Constitution. Leave the matter and religion and to the family, altar, and the church, and the private schools supported by private funds, said Grant. Keep church and state forever separate. Even more important are the economic accomplishments of the Grant administration. The fact is, Grant did save the economy. He weaned the country from the greenback inflation following the Civil War, established a sound currency that facilitated the nation's growth, and that by the end of the century had made the dollar the world's most respected medium of exchange. In Grant's own mind, his 1874 veto of the inflation bill, followed by the passage of the Resumption Act, that means the resuming the gold standard, the following year, were the two greatest achievements of his administration. Above all, Grant provided stability. After 8 years of war and upheaval, he steadied the nation. His rock-like presence in the White House comforted the nation and hastened the return to normalcy. And as he prepared to leave office, his calming influence reassured the nation in the Hayes-Tilton election dispute of 1876. Grant stepped in, called the parties together, fashioned the formula for adjudicating the results, and rammed it through Congress, and the country trusted Grant to do so. Politically, Grant's legacy is to the Republican Party. Remember that the Republican Party was founded as an abolitionist movement in the 1850s. After the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, it had lost its rationale. And it was Grant's veto of the inflation bill and the passage of the Resumption Act that gave it a new one. Under Grant, the GOP became the party of fiscal responsibility, a sound dollar, and the supporter of corporate America. The conservative heritage that distinguished the Republican Party for the next 100 years. Finally, Grant left a literary legacy of enormous magnitude. Grant was the first president to write his memoirs. There are 5 separate editions that are still in print today. They not only sold phenomenally, but are unique with the candor with which Grant presented the war. Literary critics, as demanding as Gertrude Stein and Edmund Wilson, considered Grant's memoirs not only the finest military memoirs ever written, but among the greatest works by an American author. But it was not just the memoirs. Grant's military orders, written on horseback in the heat of battle, really provide a textbook example of brevity, precision, and clarity. His orders to Meade in the spring of 1864, for example. Lee's army will be your objective point. Where Lee goes, there you will go also. Now, I could talk about General Grant endlessly, but endless is a word that a speaker should never use. I remember in 1992, when I was at the University of Toronto, going to see one of the World Series games. Boomer Wells was on the mound for Toronto and getting shelled unmercifully by the Atlanta Braves. Cito Gaston, the Blue Jay manager, went out to the mound and to relieve Wells. And Wells said he wasn't tired. And Gaston said, I know, but the outfielders are. I'm not tired, but I know you must be. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks very much. Please.
In the book I read recently by Professor McPherson,
Can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
He'll repeat the question.
I'll repeat it if I can.
What happened with the predecessors to Grant in all the failures in getting the military where it needed to be in the Civil War versus Grant and how he clicked with Lincoln? What was the difference between all the different guys that kind of cycled through as the head of the War Department and various folks versus Grant, who suddenly came out of nowhere and seemed to click with Lincoln, and the next thing you knew, fairly shortly.
What was the difference between Grant and his predecessors as General-in-Chief of the Army of the United States? Basically, I think Grant had confidence in himself and was determined to go on the defensive and beat the enemy army. Initially, Winfield Scott had been the commanding general when the war began. He was much too old. He was succeeded by McClellan. None of Grant's predecessors were really quite as interested in destroying the enemy army as Grant was. And I think Grant brought a single-mindedness to the job. That single-mindedness, for example, I believe is reflected in the fact that he left General Halleck in Washington as Chief of Staff to deal with all the supply and the maintenance and the political issues and so forth, and he took to the field because his being in the field made the difference. We had that picture there of Grant at the Wilderness. Now, Grant is here at the Wilderness, that great battle in May of 1864. Grant is not commanding these guys. This is the Army of the Potomac, but Grant is there as General-in-Chief in charge of all the Union armies. And if it had been up to Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac after this great battle, Meade would have gone back across the Potomac. Grant is there, and Grant said, move south. I think that's the big difference, that Grant was continually on the offensive, and Grant knew that he could trade man for man, or 2 men for 1 man, or 3 men for 1 man, and that Lee eventually was going to run out of men. I'm exaggerating, but essentially that was Grant's calculation, and that was, in Grant's view, the way to end the war most quickly. So I think that's a big difference between Grant and his predecessors. Yes, sir?
Is there any truth to the stories I've heard that Grant was anti-Semitic?
Is there any truth to the story that Grant was anti-Semitic? Yes and no. Yes, when Grant was commanding in the Missouri Valley, his first command, really before Fort Donelson, he issued a famous order, Order Number 11, in which he ordered all people of Jewish extraction out of his jurisdiction. It was unwise, it was unthought out. Grant regretted it immediately. The War Department overruled him within a week. Grant, for the rest of his life, tried to live that down. And I think he did live that down. Grant was concerned about traitors, people running contraband, and he just labeled them as being Jewish. And he issued that order. It was unfortunate. There are several books written about the order. Grant spent the rest of his life doing his best to make amends for having done it. So I think that overall the answer is no, but there is quite clearly that outcropping very early in Grant's career. I'm sorry, sir.
Can you talk about the meetings between Lee and Grant, the couple times they met, describe some of those circumstances and the interaction they had?
The relationship between Lee and Grant, they served together in the Mexican War, but Lee was a lieutenant colonel in the Mexican War on the staff of General Scott, and Grant was a lieutenant quartermaster, and that they really didn't meet during the war itself. And they really did not meet until Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Longstreet, on the other hand, who was one of Lee's corps commanders and a very senior Confederate general, was a very close friend of Grant. Julia was a relative of Longstreet. Grant and Longstreet were very close. Lee and Grant did not meet, had never really met until Lee came to surrender. And when they were there, Grant began the meeting with Lee by reminiscing their time in the Mexican War, and went on for several minutes talking about Mexico. And Lee had to remind him why he was there. Grant was a little embarrassed by the episode, because Grant came in from the field, and he was muddy boot general. He was wearing the uniform of a private with his 4 stars on his shoulder, and that was it. And Lee was there, finely attired with sword and whatever. Grant made a point of not taking Lee's sword, and in the order that he wrote out, the surrender order, he said that the officers may retain their sidearms. He didn't want any part of that, and they got along quite. Grant was as humane as he could be. Lee respected that. Lee had been very apprehensive about going to see Grant. He talked to Longstreet before, and Longstreet really told him, "Don't worry about it. Grant will be very generous," which he was. They met the following day between the two armies, and I might say that as soon as the Confederate army surrendered, they were out of everything, and Grant ordered the quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac to feed the Confederate army and so forth. They met between the lines the next day. Grant did his best to impress on Lee how important it was for Lee to take a lead in bringing the South back into the Union. They were sort of talking over each other's head at that point, or talking. There was really no longer any communication between the two. And I believe the only other time they met was later when Grant was president. Lee came to Washington. Lee was a representative, a lobbyist for railroad companies, and it was a very formal conversation at that time. Most importantly, though, I think, immediately after Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson became president, Johnson wanted to try the Confederate leadership for treason. I'm trying to find a picture of the peacemakers. There we go. Of the peacemakers. Lincoln had told Grant what he wanted the South to do, or how he wanted the South to be treated. Grant asked him, if we catch Jefferson Davis, what should we do with him? And he said, well, let's hope Jefferson Davis skips and goes to Europe. It gets up, avoids us, so we don't have to deal with that problem. Grant, in the terms of surrender at Appomattox, if you recall, had said that all of the officers and men of the Confederate Army who return to their homes and abide by the laws where they reside will never again be disturbed by the authority of the United States. That was Lincoln's view. What Grant was doing by doing that personally was pardoning the entire Army of Northern Virginia with that statement. They were not going to be tried for treason or anything else. They go home and they behave themselves. That's it. The United States Attorney, under President Johnson's order, the United States Attorney in Norfolk, indicted Lee and Johnston and Longstreet for treason. Lee wrote to Grant, and Grant went in to see President Johnson and said, "You can't do that." And Johnson said, "When can I try them?" And Grant said, "Never." Grant's prestige was such, and Johnson's was not, that Johnson acquiesced, and the indictment of Lee and Longstreet and Johnston was canceled. So there was some relationship between them, but they were never close. They were never close. Please.
The only memorial we have of Grant is Grant's tomb on Riverside Drive, or are there some other recognitions in Washington I just don't know about?
Well, let me say a word in favor of Grant's tomb in New York. Grant's tomb in New York is a marvel. It's up near Columbia, 125th and Riverside Drive. It is a marvelous edifice. It's hard to believe it, but 1.5 million people watched the parade on Broadway when Grant was buried in the tomb that day, and it was a really a coming together. But to answer your question, yes, there is a marvelous equestrian statue of Grant on the west front of the Capitol. If you saw President Obama's most recent inauguration on the west front, down in the foreground, there is a marvelous equestrian statue of Grant. It's in need of repair, apparently, but it is probably the largest equestrian statue in Washington. It is a very fine statue of Grant there. I don't know about, sir. I don't know about. The papers of General Grant, the Grant Presidential Library, you might be interested, is at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. For those of you who don't think times have changed, I suggest you go to Starkville. Any further?
Are there descendants of President Grant to this day?
Descendants of President Grant have been in the United States service throughout. Back during the Vietnam War, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet was Ulysses S. Grant III, or the fourth. Yes, they continue. They continue.
John,
Go ahead. We'll start there.
thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Is this, how do you say, a derogatory photograph or a painting?
This is a painting.
Oh, it's wonderful.
This is a painting, and it hangs in the White House.
Oh.
We have a lot of questions over here. Try that one. Go ahead,
Please.
sir.
I've often wondered why Grant did not continue his autobiography through his presidential years. What do you think about that? Why he did not continue to write it? Why he did not write about his presidency?
As I said, it's 1952 when I took Architecture 101. I'm familiar with this. He was dying of cancer. He was dying of cancer. He got the last page written just before he died. So he was dead. Please.
What was the relationship between Sherman and Grant, and how were their styles different?
Sherman and Thomas were 3 years ahead of Grant at West Point. Sherman ranked Grant in the regular army. They had both gotten out and came back. Sherman was commissioned. Didn't hurt that his brother was a senator from Ohio. Was commissioned back into the regular army. He ranked Grant. Initially in the Mississippi Valley. He ranked Grant up until after the surrender at Fort Donelson, when Grant ranked him. And Sherman was with Grant at Shiloh, and was with Grant in Mississippi, and with Grant at Chattanooga, and they were very close. Despite the fact, I mean, it's interesting. All of these people who ranked Grant in the regular army had not at least a problem in working for him when Grant became, just as Eisenhower in World War II, in many respects. Grant and Sherman were very close, and they remained very close for the rest of their lives. But Sherman succeeded Grant as commanding general of the army when Grant became president. And that doesn't mean they didn't have disagreements. Sherman was not a friend of Grant's peace policy on the Great Plains. At Shiloh, the Great Battle of Shiloh, which was a terrible Sunday for the Union Army, Sherman told Grant, well, we'd better retreat and put the Tennessee River between us and the Confederates, and Grant said, no, we'll lick them tomorrow. And they respected each other. And Meade thought when Grant became General-in-Chief that he was going to bring Sherman back to command the Army of the Potomac. And Grant just left Sherman in charge out west, and he came back and left Meade where he was. And their wives were also very close. Their families were close. They lived in Washington. But again, there were things they disagreed on. Necessarily, when Grant was president and Sherman was general-in-chief, they had differences on military expenditures and so forth. Please, sir.
Any thoughts of where the name or why he was named Ulysses?
I can answer the middle question, the middle of the initial. I can't answer Ulysses. Your parents pick names out of the air.
His middle name? Ulysses?
No, Ulysses S. Grant. And he was simply named Ulysses S. Grant. He did not have a middle name. He is not Ulysses Simpson Grant, although on his mother's side they were Simpsons. When Grant received his appointment to the military academy, the congressman signed the appointment papers Ulysses Simpson Grant because he thought that was Grant's middle name. It wasn't. It was just Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant, rather than tell the military academy they were wrong, he simply wrote Ulysses Simpson Grant. But his name is Ulysses S. Grant. No, nothing after that. It's like Eisenhower. Eisenhower was named David Dwight Eisenhower. That was when he was born, he was named David Dwight Eisenhower for his father. He changed it to Dwight David Eisenhower. These things happen.
Questions at the back of the room here?
Dean Sickles almost caused Meade the Battle of Gettysburg and consequently the war. Meade didn't think highly of him. History hasn't treated him well. What did Grant think of Sickles, and what did he end up doing with him?
With Sickles? Yeah. Sickles later under Grant, became the United States ambassador to Madrid. So Grant apparently had a reasonably high opinion of Sickles. I can't say that during the war itself, when Grant came east, I'm not sure where Sickles was at that time. Sickles, I believe, had gone west to Missouri. I don't think Sickles ever served under Grant. When Grant was in the west, Sickles was in the east with the Army of the Potomac, and then I believe that Sickles went west, and Grant came east, and they didn't serve. Sickles was later in Missouri, and was a friend of Grant's peace policy further out west. And as I said, Grant did ultimately make an ambassador to Moscow.
Let's take one more question here. You, sir?
Yeah, there's if I remember correctly, there's in northern Illinois, northwestern Illinois, there's Helena, Illinois, and there's a Grant's home there.
Grant's home in Helena, Illinois.
What's the connection?
Sir, I have to say I don't know. I'm sorry
Okay.
I
we can't
have to
end that way. Let's try one more question. Go ahead, please.
Is it true that Grant is founder of the NRA?
Is it true that Grant is what now?
Founder of the NRA.
Founder of the NRA.
Well, Carlton Heston might think so. Grant may have owned a sidearm, or he may have owned a shotgun, or whatever. But I do not believe that Grant was a conscious founder of the National Rifle Association.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Certainly the NRA was established after the Civil War by Civil War veterans who believed they had a right to carry their rifles, but mostly for hunting purposes at that time. I hope that you will thank you for that great lecture, Dr. Smith. He's at the back of the room now, ready to sign books if you care to buy his biography on Grant. Next week's lecture will be on James Garfield, and I hope to see you all there. Thanks again to our sponsors, the Dreyfus Family Foundation and the Palm Beach Post, and thanks to those who joined us online. We hope to see you next week, if not before. Thank you.